Can everyone hear me? I think this is on. It's not. Uh, Not an electrician either. There we go. First off, I'd like to say good evening to everyone, and I'm glad that everybody made it out in the weather as cold as it's been lately. It's surprising you go out any place. And as everybody knows, this last week's talks have been sponsored by the Institute on National Affairs, and what that is it's a student organization, student and faculty organization funded by GSB. And our topic this week has been the American economic system. Is it obsolete? And we have a few changes from our brochure that you might want to take a look at. And the Thursday night speaker, or the speaker for tomorrow night, is Dr. Ball, and he's from Syracuse. He'll be speaking on urban revitalization, but Gans could not make it, so I'd like to draw that to your attention. I'd also like to remind you that if you have any further questions for Lester Thoreau or for Professor Tobin, the Dimension 5 tonight at 10 o'clock would be a good thing to listen to. Or is it 11? Oh, okay. Thank you. Guess I'm getting my speeches mixed up too. Our speaker tonight is get started here, right? Our speaker tonight is James Tobin, and comes from Yale University. He's been there since 1950, and he's been a Sterling professor since 1957. He's taken part in an awful lot of economic organizations, such as the American Economic Association, the Eastern Economic Association. He's also been on the Council for Economic Advisors during the Kennedy administration from 1961 to 62. He's written several books, amongst which have been The National Economic Policies, Essays on Economics, and also The New Economics, a decade older. He's published several works in various academic journals, and his topic tonight will be Must We Live with Stagflation? I'm very proud to introduce to you tonight Professor James Tobin.
Thank you, Mary. Is this actually on? If you can hear me in the back, raise your hand. Sometimes speakers ask you, sitting in the back, to raise your hand if you can't hear them, which strikes me as not a very efficient request. Well, I'm going to talk a bit about inflation and stagflation, how we got into it and whether we can get out of it and so on. I do think that there's an awful lot of economic hypochondria around the country these days. Most people seem to think that the economy is in a terrible mess and everything's going to hell. But actually the condition of the American economy and its recent performance and its outlook, although they're not ideal to be sure, scarcely justify the degree of despair and poor-mouthing that is prevalent in the country. I'm not easy to please on matters such as this, but I would like to point out a few facts that may have escaped you. One is that we have enjoyed now almost 4 years of fairly steady recovery from the severe recession of 1974 and 1975, which is the sharpest setback in economic activity that the country's experienced since the Great Depression. And secondly, Our gross national product, the volume of national output, corrected for inflation, so just measuring its physical volume, was about 15% larger last year than it was in 1975 when the recovery began, and 12% larger than in the year of prosperity before the recession in 1973. Thirdly, about 10 million more people are at work than either of those years, 1973 or 1975, and the unemployment rate has been reduced from 9% at the trough of the recession in early 1975 to 6% now. It's still a point higher than it was in 1973, and thus, in my opinion, is still too high. Moreover, most of these new jobs are private sector jobs, and not of the 10 million, 7 million are created in the private sector since the recovery began. Fourthly, after-tax disposable income corrected for inflation is 10% higher per capita than it was in 1973 before the recession, and that was the year of prosperity. Fifthly, corporate profits after taxes have been rising smartly, especially in recent months, and they now stand in real terms 20% above the prosperous year of 1973. And business investment has shown some signs at long last of responding to the improvement in profits, although the outlook for business investment in the coming year is not as favorable. And sixth, even though there are disturbing possibilities of another recession beginning in 1979 or 1980, there are also good reasons to expect that 1979 will be a pretty good year of continued recovery and growth of output. In fact, the real economy is doing so well that the policymakers in Washington are a bit embarrassed by it because they are wishing for some slowdown, if not for a real recession. Now, in this recital, I concentrate on real indicators that have to do with production and consumption of goods and services, and that's what the economy is all about. But those indicators don't make the daily headlines. The headlines are usually feeding the national hypochondria by being obsessed with monthly reports on price inflation, or the, before November 1st at any rate, the latest daily defeat of the dollar in the International Currency Olympics. And I would observe that it takes an affluent society like ours, with a majority who are hardened or oblivious to such real economic stress that there is within it and outside it, to regard inflation as the #1 economic problem of the society. Most people on earth are too poor, and their economies are too backward to afford that luxury, and if they have inflation, as most of them do, they take chronic inflation for granted. And our own society faces some very difficult problems and adjustments. Cities, or some of our cities, are still pathological in sociological and economic terms. We have the continuing problem of the transition from fossil fuels to other sources of energy. We noticed that which was the keynote of Carter's States of the Union address previous to this year hardly got mentioned this year in his preoccupation with inflation. We have still the problems of preservation of our natural environment, and so on. Well, inflation is not a pleasant condition or a pleasant malady, but there are worse social diseases and indeed some of them include the cures, or at least some of the cures offered for inflation itself. Now, I guess everybody's seen cartoons that depict the monstrous dragon of inflation devouring the nation's means of subsistence. And if you haven't seen such cartoons, you can hear them in stump speeches, political messages, or read them in editorials. In a memorable comment, at least memorable to me, President Ford once said that after all, only 8% of the people lose from unemployment. That's what the unemployment rate was at the time, while everybody loses from inflation. And, well, don't we all lose when we all have to pay higher and higher prices for everything we buy? The negative answer to that question is as obvious as it is commonly neglected. So never forget that one man's price is another's income, and the price that outrages the buyer can be usually thought of as the seller's just income. Urban consumers like me and Lester Thoreau over here don't like rising food prices, but someone receives those dollars, processors, middlemen, grocery clerks, and I'm led to believe farmers in Iowa. And workers whose productivity has increased 2% per year think they have earned the 10% wage increases they get, and then they blame something called inflation when they find that the appliances they were making cost 8% more to buy in the department stores. Well, what really matters to economic welfare is not how much a dollar will buy, but how much an hour of labor will buy. When people tell you how many more dollars it costs to buy something now compared to 1950 or 1960 or 1970, then you might also ask how many more dollars does the normal guy get for an hour of work. So what makes people lose is when the prices of what they want to buy rise relative to the prices of what they have to sell, not when both sets of prices move in step up or down. Now, relative prices are the things that cause changes in welfare and changes in fortunes, and they're always moving around, and they are moving in unexpected ways to the good fortune of some of us and the misfortune of others. That happens when there's general inflation, and it happens at other times too, when there's deflation or when prices are stable. Stability of the general price level, zero inflation, doesn't mean that nobody is losing and nobody else is gaining, because that stability always conceals a considerable flux in relative prices of some kinds of labor and other kinds of labor, of food and industrial products, and so on. Give another example close to my own profession of teaching. We know that demographic political changes, by which I mean the decline in birth rates and the attitudes of citizens and legislatures and private donors about education, have produced a situation of excess supply in the teaching occupation, at least in college teaching, I guess generally. And as a result of that, I expect salaries in our profession are lagging behind the cost of living. And my colleagues who are not in economics tell me, see what inflation is doing to us, and I suspect that it's more basic and that for real good causes, the relative prices of college teachers would be falling at this particular time of the century. Or consider oil and gas prices. The OPEC hurt us as a nation because we have to work 3 or 4 times as hard to import a barrel of oil. It happened that the blow came in inflationary times in 73 and 74 and contributed itself mightily to the scary double-digit inflation of 1973-75. And ever since then, I guess you've been hearing about how inflation, including the inflation of energy prices, is hurting people. But the true pain was due to an adverse shift in what economists refer to as our terms of trade, the amount of products and labor of the United States that we have to give in order to get a barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia. And that would have been true whether it was in inflationary times or not. Now, it may happen that periods of substantial changes in relative prices are also somewhat more inflationary than other periods, as the OPEC example illustrates. Because when the price of oil went up by 3 or 4 times, that change in relative prices was made by an increase in the prices of oil and oil products and substitutes for petroleum as energy. It wasn't made very much at all by a fall or a lag in other prices of other commodities. There's sort of ratchet effect there, that when there have to be big changes in relative prices in our economic and social institutions, it's a lot easier to make those changes by raising the prices that are rising relatively than by lowering the ones in the rest of the economy. So you could say, in a sense, that inflation was a byproduct of the change in relative prices that occurred, but it was the change in relative prices and not the byproduct of inflation that was the real loss to the nation. But what's happened is that the word inflation has become a substitute for analysis and thought, and a sort of catch-all explanation for all economic reverses and disappointments. And when pollsters go out and interview the population, they've been telling them that inflation is problem number 1 in the country. And that message was heard in Washington for sure, and so the president says it's problem number 1 also. But the people are probably really voicing disappointment and anxiety about their standards of living, which are always their central economic concerns. Now, when I first was asked to come here, one of the questions that was addressed to me for this talk was, can we have prosperity without inflation? I guess that's really the same title as Mary gave, Must We Have Stagflation? But as to the first question, it is a fact that historically we have had periods of prosperity without inflation. Examples are the 1920s, although in Iowa they might not have thought the 1920s were that prosperous, because one of the sources of stability in the overall price level was the fact that before the days of AAA and other government price support programs, farm prices were declining, not only relatively but absolutely in the 1920s, and that helped make prices in general stable. Another era of relatively stable prices in the 1950s. Although there was an outbreak of inflation that alarmed people quite a lot in the middle 1950s when the inflation rate got up to 4%. If we could settle for 4% tomorrow, I think there would be rejoicing in the streets, certainly in the White House. The stability of the 1950s in prices, or at least from our present perspective, was purchased at some cost in the form of 3 recessions, which served to lower the rate of inflation, for example, lower the rate of inflation that had the 4% rate of inflation that emerged in the middle 1950s. And we had another period of price stability in the early 1960s, from 1961 to 1965, when the inflation rate was 1.5% or something like that, a period of expansion during which unemployment was reduced from 7%, the beginning of the period, to 4% in 1965, without an appreciable acceleration of inflation, or noticeable acceleration of inflation. So we have had, within living memory, at least of some of us, the periods of prosperity combined with relatively little inflation. It is more difficult to find periods of prosperity that accompany deflation. In fact, most of the periods that would be identified in American history as times of trouble economically are periods when prices in general were declining. Since the Great Depression of the 1930s, since recovery began in the Roosevelt administration in 1933, and certainly since the Second World War, we have not had any periods of deflation. There's been, I think, with the exception of 1 year, steady increases in prices. So there seems to have been a change in the fact that before the Second World War, before the Great Depression, we had much wider and more rapid oscillations of prices. Times when prices rose 13, 15% for a year or two and then went down precipitously the next year. And we haven't had that in recent history. Striking fact is that since Second World War, in this country as in others, prices and wages seem to be less flexible going down than they were in the past, and less flexible going down than they are going up. And so we have a sort of ratchet effect which produces a general trend upward. And we've noticed now in the 1970s that recessions, we've had 2, one in 1970-71, one in 1974-1975. Both of them could be said to have been deliberate recessions, deliberate acts of policy by the federal government in the interests of reducing the rate of inflation. And neither of them was as effective in doing that as the architects hoped they would be, or as effective as the recessions of the 1950s appeared to be in accomplishing the same task. We may be about to have a third 1970s recession, and that will be for the same purpose. I'll come back to that. later. Now, intrinsically, there's no, at least there seem to be no reason why we can't get the same real results, the same volumes of production, employment, same economic growth in real terms, with 0 inflation or 2% inflation or 10% inflation as we do with 6 or 7% inflation. Because real outcomes basically depend on those relative prices I was talking about and not on absolute prices. For example, in the early 1960s, we had a pattern in the economy in which money wage rates were increasing around 3 or 4% per year, and prices were increasing around 1 to 2% per year. The difference between those two was the rate of growth of labor productivity, which makes a 3% wage increase compatible with a 1% price increase, because the labor costs are only rising 1% when productivity is increasing 2%. And interest rates were accordingly around 3 to 5%. In the 1970s, we have much the same pattern, only everything stepped up by about 5 points now. Wages rising 8 to 9%, prices rising 6 to 7%, interest rates 8 to 10%. So why do we have worse inflation now than we had in the 1970s, or why do we have inflation at all? I have 2 propositions I'd like to emphasize. One is that not every episode of inflation has the same causes. There are a number of different sources. And second is that there is since no simplistic single cause theory of inflation will really do, a remedy is not always the same, and a remedy may not be simple. A little history on the American inflation after 1965. In the late 1960s, the dominant economic event was the escalation of the war in Vietnam. Now, that escalation was a disaster for the country in many dimensions, and one of those dimensions was, surely not the most important, but one of the dimensions was the decision of the president in 1966 as to how to finance the war. Now, he chose not to ask for additional taxes from the Congress for financing the increase in military expenditures for the Vietnam War. The economy was already at 4% unemployment, something that was regarded then as full employment. And the additional demands of the government for resources for Vietnam, soldiers and materiel, were piled in on top of an economy that was already going full blast. So we had a classic case of excess demand inflation. You can contrast the actions of President Truman in a similar situation with the Korean War, which was actually a much bigger deal in economic terms, in terms of the resources required for it relative to national product. And President Truman asked for and got taxes that paid for the war entirely. And there was very little inflation connected with the Korean War after the initial surge of speculation in 1950, which occurred really before the economic impact of war procurement affected the economy. During the late 60s then, during the Vietnam War, the inflation rate rose from about 2%, as it was in the early 60s, to 5%. Well, in 1970-71, we had a policy-induced recession to try to do something about the inflation. It succeeded in reducing the rate of inflation by about 1 point to 4%. After the President, Nixon, got frustrated by the failure of that policy to do more than that, he turned to wage and price controls, and that they also I really should have included them in the factors that brought about the 1% reduction in the rate of inflation. In 73 and 74, 73 we had return to prosperity and something like 5% unemployment, a prosperous economy, and there was a kind of worldwide boom in, particularly in materials, and there was a food price surge for various reasons to the benefit of farm producers all over the world and this country. And there was OPEC. And all that together raised the rate of inflation as I'm measuring it, which is not the cost of living index, but the overall index connected with the national income accounts, raised the rate of inflation to 9% for a period of time. Double digits at some particular moments of time by some particular indexes. We lost 3 points of that inflation, possibly some of that due to the recession of 74, 75. Most of it, in my opinion, just due to the fact that OPEC didn't quadruple the prices every year. They did it once, and that contributed to inflation when they did it, and while it was being absorbed, but they didn't do it every year. So you would expect that as far as the rate of inflation is concerned, not the level of prices, that it wouldn't continue at the rate, at the temporarily higher rate. And it didn't. The same is true of some other things like farm prices, which came down again. So we got back to a 6% rate of inflation, which was more or less constant during the period 75, 78. And 78, we had a surprise in that the rate of inflation seemed to go up again, maybe we don't know really how much of that is one-shot events and how much of it represents a permanent. The general improvement of the economy and tightening of demand about 0.3 of a point. Now let me mention some of the explanations that are given for inflation, and many of them you've all heard and hear every day. First, there's government finance, budget deficits in particular. There's no doubt that government deficit spending has been responsible for inflation in many countries many times in history, and I gave you an example just a few moments ago of a case in this country where it was true, the financing of the Vietnam War. Now, there's a standard, that's an example of a standard scenario by which a government needing to get extra resources for its own purposes out of the economy afraid or unwilling to tax to get the resources obtains them by printing money or borrowing money and bidding for the resources against its citizens, at the expense of those citizens who are the slowest to react or catch on, or who have incomes that are sticky or fixed. But that is, the fact that that has happened and could happen again doesn't mean that large budgets or deficits are necessarily inflationary. Times when they're not, for example, is when the economy is slack, when there are large amounts of excess capacity, large reserves of labor in the economy, so that the injections of purchasing power from the government do not bid away resources from private use, but actually cause additional employment and production. So there's enough capacity in the economy to produce both for the government and for the private sector. Well, a recent example is that we ran in the United States budget mammoth deficits in the period of the recession in 1975, 76, and they did not increase the rate of inflation, which was indeed, if anything, falling from its peaks in 1974 at the time. The present time, the President has committed himself to a budget with a smaller deficit, a $30 billion or $29 billion deficit for the fiscal year 1980. And some current comment on that seems to me to be misguided. It's been pointed out that that deficit might be larger if there's a recession, and indeed it will be larger if there's a recession. That is, if economic activity does not meet the President's predictions, then profits, wages, and other incomes will not be as large as anticipated, and the taxes which are based on them will not be as large as anticipated. Some transfer payments, like unemployment insurance, will be, on the other hand, greater than anticipated, and the deficit will be larger. The fact that the deficit is larger because the economy is weak is definitely not inflationary. It's a sign of weakness of the economy, not shortages of goods and of the capacity to produce goods in the economy. Another common explanation of inflation is excessive creation of money by the central bank, or printing of money to meet government's bills, so that somewhat overlaps with the budget deficit point. But it's also true that independent of the budget, whether it's in deficit or not, money can be created at the instance of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and might be a source of excess demand in the economy. That is, interest rates might be set too low, encourage too much expenditure on housing and on investment, and have the same effect of overstraining or overheating the economy as government expenditure itself. Well, I suspect it's going to be very hard, it is very hard for anybody to find examples of deliberate, spontaneous, willful inflation by central banks. I know quite a few central bankers, and I've never found a single one of them who had a good word to say about inflation. And it's hard for me to believe that any of them would be willing sources of inflationary increases in money supply. Well, sometimes they make errors. They might have made one in 72. They might have made one in 1968 in miscalculating the strength of the economy and providing easier money than the situation demanded. On some occasions, they've made the opposite errors. But usually, when the monetary authorities are creating money at a rate which is inflationary, what they're doing is accommodating an ongoing inflation that's already there. And the reason they do it reluctantly is because, as I shall explain in a minute, the consequences of not doing so are very painful, or could be very painful. Now, the third point I'd like to make about multiple forms and sources of inflation is to refer again to the ratchet effect I was talking about earlier and to what I would term the inflationary bias of modern economies. It results, I think, from the power of various sectors of the economy to protect their real incomes, either politically or economically. And those could be unions, sometimes unorganized workers, protectionists who, like the steel industry, who get the trigger price formula when foreign imports are too competitive. Could be farm organizations that have the power to keep prices rising when demand and crop supplies are favorable to them, and to keep them from falling by government price support and other crop restriction and other acreage restrictions when the supply-demand situation turns the other way. It could be oligopolies who are reluctant to reduce prices in recessionary periods for fear that price wars will break out and destroy their tacit oligopolistic agreements. We have very much insider syndrome in the setting of wages and prices. And people in unions and other organizations worry much more about the well-being of the beneficiaries who are already employed or already in business than they do about people who are not employed or outside. When in regard to inflationary bias, even at the time when I was a graduate student in economics, which is a long time ago, a common aphorism in the halls and beer parlors and so on was that there are three goals that are impossible of being fulfilled simultaneously in a democratic capitalist society. And they are stability of prices, that is, absence of inflation. Second, full employment, that is, not having excessive unemployment rates. And third, avoiding price and wage controls or other direct interventions into price and wage setting. Now, those are, or another way to put it, there are three things you would like to avoid: inflation, unemployment, and controls, and you can at most avoid two of them. Sometimes we don't avoid any of them. Sometimes we avoid only one. But the basic point there is that there is an inflationary bias in the structure of the institutions of democratic capitalist societies, and that independently of government finance or monetary policy is going to be a source of inflation. And I go back to the point I was making before, that often the only way that relative price changes that need to occur in the society can occur is by having some upward trend in the price level. Now, the main reason I think that we've had inflation in the United States in recent years is that we had it before. It's a very stubborn and persistent entrenched trend, and it feeds on itself more or less independently of the economic circumstances of the day. The pattern is self-consistent in the sense that wages rise, let's say 8 or 9%, after productivity gains are taken into account. That's consistent with price increases of 6 or 7%, let's say, and those indeed go into the cost of living index, and together with the fact that other people's wages have been increasing at that rate, they perpetuate another round of wage increases at the same rate. There's a lot of leapfrogging, of emulation involved. People look over their shoulders and see what the other union got. The auto workers are going to look back and see what the Teamsters got, what the steel workers got, and so on. And it's repetitive, as well as what they themselves got last time, and this kind of repetitive pattern that has a lot of momentum. The employers, on the other hand, can figure, well, this is the pattern. I pay the pattern. I'm a good employer. Other people are paying that too, and I won't be disadvantaged relative to my competition if I pay the going wage increase. And neither will I be showing that I'm being a cutthroat competitor if I go with the standard price increase. Some people refer to all this as not as catching up and as emulation, but in terms of expectations. I don't really see how you can tell much the difference between them. They're certainly connected, and sort of part of the reason that you get wage rounds the way we have is that people want to catch up with the wage increases other guys have got, the cost of living increases that have occurred, and also with the cost of living increases they expect to have happen in the next year or so. Now, let me emphasize that there's nothing intrinsic in the structure of the United States economy right now that dictates that we should have rates of inflation of 7 or 8%, or 10%, 6%. If I describe to some economist or observer who had been, like Rip Van Winkle, asleep for 30 years or just returned from a space voyage, if I describe the economy in real terms, how much unemployment there was, how much excess capacity there was, what the production rate was, et cetera, and asked that person, tell me what you think the rate of inflation is in this economy, he wouldn't be able to tell him. It wouldn't look that different, really, from the 1961-65 period when the rate of inflation, as I already related, was 5 points lower than it is now. And so the reason that we have the rate of inflation we have now is basically historical, that we have had it and it's got itself entrenched. And some people have said it's like everybody standing up at a football game. They can't see any better than if they were all sitting down. But nobody wants to be the first one to sit down, because then he won't be able to see. And nobody wants to be the first one to move the inflation rate down for the same reason. Can't be sure the other guys are going to sit down. Well, it's sort of an impasse. The classical remedy for inflation is based on the assumption that inflation is always of the first two types that I mentioned, namely that it's a state of excess demand, general excess demand created by excessive government spending, deficit spending, or by excessive creation of money, or both. And then the classical remedy is very, very simple, and that is get rid of the budget deficits, stop printing the money. But when we don't have And when we haven't had that kind of inflation, then that remedy doesn't work very fast. And it also has a very large cost in terms of unemployment and lost production. Basically, we tried the classical medicine in 1974-75, and that was the reason for the recession of those years. And although the rate of inflation fell from the double digits at the time of the OPEC price increase and so on, it didn't fall after that. It stubbornly stayed around 6% throughout the period of high unemployment and steady but slow recovery. And one could estimate from that and other experience that if we had, let's say, a 1 point higher rate of unemployment than we have now, say 7% instead of 6% unemployment, it would take 2 years to, at least 2 years, maybe 3 or more, to reduce the rate of inflation by a point. So reduce it from where we are now down to 3 or 0 would take a decade maybe. A long time. Meanwhile, we lose the extra production that is associated with the 1 point difference in unemployment. That's not a trivial amount. Perhaps 2% of the GNP, which means about $40 billion for a point of unemployment a year. And for a long time, that would mount up to production, investment, consumption lost. And that is basically why the monetary authority, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, doesn't take the simplistic advice so many people give it. Why don't you get rid of the inflation? We know it's you caused it. It's all government caused. That's what everybody tells us. So why didn't the government do something about it? Put its own house in order and stop inflating the economy. Well, if the central bank actually did that, if the government actually, by fiscal and monetary policy, succeeded in cutting the rate of spending, aggregate spending on gross national product, on goods and services in the country, let's say by 5 points. What I mean by that is, let's suppose that in 1979, the rate of spending on GNP, on goods and services, would be higher than in 1978 by 10%. And if we take something like the present economic report projection, that 10% growth in spending would be divided between 3% growth in output and a 7% inflation increase in prices, the 3 and the 7 adding up to 10. And now suppose the government, by a combination of tighter fiscal and monetary policy, was able to reduce the growth of dollar spending from 10% to 5%. So the dollar GNP would only grow by 5%. Now the question is, if we lived in the world that some people seem to think we live in, that would mean that inflation would be reduced from 7% to 2%, and we'd still have 3% growth in output. That would be nice, wouldn't it? It would be very simple. We'd still have the same growth in production, consumption, and investment, and instead of having 7% inflation, we'd have a 2% inflation. And the government presumably knows how to do that because the Federal Reserve knows how to put the brakes on. And if the President and the Congress were serious about inflation, they could even do more on the budget than they're already doing. But the fact is, or at least the evidence of the fact is, I think, that if they reduce the rate of dollar spending from 10% to 5%, it wouldn't come out of the price increase, it would come out of the output increase. So instead of having a 3% output increase, we have a minus 2% output increase and still have the 7% inflation. And that's because of the stubbornness of the inflationary trend built in to the economy, at least in the short run. Now maybe you do it for a decade, and if you do it with 9% unemployment instead of 7% unemployment, you can get it done faster. If you do it that way, maybe eventually going along with 5% instead of 10% growth in money stock and in money spending on GNP, you get the rate of inflation down. It'd take a long time and a lot of unemployment and a lot of loss of output. So it's not stupidity or perverseness or even complacency about inflation that leads Chairman Miller, President Carter, and other governments in other countries to not to adopt the simple advice that every editorial in the Wall Street Journal tells them to do. It's because it would be extremely costly to the economy and socially disruptive. Now that's why we actually have to look at that third objective of the three incompatible ones that I referred to a few minutes ago. And that's why the Carter administration finally came around to the conclusion that some direct attack on the wage price spiral was necessary. You couldn't do it just indirectly by slowing the economy down. And so if you wanted to do it at all and not live with the present rate of inflation, when the public doesn't want to live with the present rate of inflation, then it would have to be done by some direct intervention in wage and price decisions and negotiations, and what is euphemistically called in Europe incomes policy. Well, basically what it means is the government doing something to influence price setting and wage setting in the economy. Now, since we had what everybody says was a bad experience under the Nixon wage price controls in 1971-73, nobody will get up and say that we ought to, except Kenneth Galbraith, will get up and say we ought to have mandatory wage and price controls. And so what we're having is something not as striking and compulsory as that. Semi-voluntary controls, standards or guideposts, but an attempt is being made. And really is essential. I don't see any other way out of the impasse. Problem with the country for several years has been that there are really only three alternatives about this inflation business. You know, one was to forget about it and just live with it, try not to overheat the economy, but give up the idea we're going to reduce the rate of inflation significantly. Another one was to adopt the severe classical remedy. Say we really got to have a recession or depression and let's go through with it until we get rid of this inflation. And the only other one is to have the some kind of incomes policy, some kind of direct unwinding of the inflationary spiral. There aren't any other alternatives, and you got to choose one. And like a little child who says he's hungry but won't eat any of the three things on his plate, it's not particularly mature to say, I don't like any of the remedies here. I don't like any of the alternatives, if they're the only ones there are. The public in the polls, when they say inflation is enemy number one, are scarcely giving a mandate, I think, for the austere policy of recession, depression, and higher unemployment. If I'm right in believing that what they really mean is that they wish their real incomes were higher and they're scared about whether they're going to keep the real incomes they have, then it seems to add injury to insult to present them then with a policy which is bound to reduce their real incomes, namely reducing the level of employment and production in the country and consumption. So what they also say explicitly in the polls is they want controls. George Meany may not like them, and the National Association of Manufacturers may not like controls, but the public at large thinks naturally, instinctively, that that's the remedy for the inflation. Well, in the longer run, perhaps the question of whether we can do anything about what I refer to as the inflationary bias of the economy. We certainly can't do anything about that in time to have any effect on the present inflation or the present dilemma or the present impasse. History suggests that we can't do much about it or that we won't do much about it because the same question has come up before, again and again. Presumably there are things we could do to make the economy more competitive and to make unions think more about the people who aren't employed as well as the people who are, and to make wages and prices both more flexible downward as well as upward. Many of those things would be good things in themselves, and they would help in the inflation front as well. Well, understand the title of the series as a whole is whether the American economy is obsolete. The American economic system is obsolete. I don't think it is, and we're not confronted by a disaster like the Great Depression. We're not confronted by a great natural disaster, ecological disaster. We don't have at the moment an immediate big energy shortage, and so on. And as I said at the beginning, the economy has been doing quite well, much better than people generally think it has been since 1973, certainly since 1975. Most of the real damage that we've suffered during this period has been due to the deliberately severe recession that was not inflation, but the attempt to bring inflation under control, and to the unavoidable shocks that made the inflation as high as it was in 74, 75, OPEC. I think it would be a real irony if, after democratic capitalism, in this country and throughout the Western world, has put in an amazingly successful performance in the last 3 decades since the Second World War. An unparalleled period of progress in free economies, in advanced countries. A success story. It would be a real irony if after that, which has really sort of falsified many of the pessimistic predictions of Marx and other people who had despaired of capitalism in the Great Depression after Marx. A real irony if after that success story, inflation and our inability to come to terms with it or to find some way of reconciling it with the performance of the economy turned out to be our Achilles heel. Well, I'm I'll be glad to receive